Welcome to the New Books Network.
As we emerge from a period of government-mandated lockdowns and as threats to free speech multiply, we would be wise to re-engage with the work of a seminal thinker on the subjects of liberty, freedom, and non-domination. We can do so most effectively by reading the 2022 book, Completely Free, The Moral and Political Vision of John Stuart Mill by John Peter DiIulio. Mill, 1806 to 1873, for all his influence on fields such as philosophy and political theory, has detractors aplenty. Conservatives consider him lukewarm on religious liberty and even slightly hostile to religion generally, and a proto-hippy in his partiality for ideas about experiments in living. For their part, progressives aren't wild about Mill's emphasis on virtue and personal character. Libertarians distrust Mill's embrace of the state when employment of it, in Mill's view, fosters harmony and a feeling of security among the populace. Crucially, for our discussion today, all of Mill's critics seem to agree that much of his thinking is hard to follow, and that he will say something in an essay or book that very much conflicts with what he says elsewhere. DiIulio's book dissects the many critiques of Mill's social and political thought and argues that Mill believed that society should aim for zero tolerance of arbitrary power and strive for the promotion and preservation of individual freedom. Given recent debates over personal freedom and bodily sovereignty issues such as mandatory mask wearing and vaccination, and the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, there could hardly be a more opportune time to drill down into Mill's writings on the various forms that domination can take. For example, domination is infantilization, domination is uncertainty, domination is diminution. Does Mill speak to us today, or is he a relic of the Victorian age in all his earnestness and lofty thinking? DiIulio's book is a strong argument for Mill's relevance and continuing appeal. DiIulio writes, Mill is dedicated above all to the idea that the chief and most significant solution to any of the ills that we face as human beings is the general cultivation of deep feeling and high aspiration. We learn how Mill managed to free himself of the mechanistic aspects of Benthamite utilitarianism in favor of a richer vision of human happiness that was friendlier to intellectual autonomy and love of the arts, while simultaneously demanding of the individual the pursuit of virtue and good character. Let's hear what John Peter DiIulio has to say about the multifaceted Mr. Mill. Hello, everyone. My name is Hope J. Lehman, and I am one of the hosts of the New Books Network. I am talking today with the author of the 2022 book, Completely Free, The Moral and Political Vision of John Stuart Mill by John Peter DiIulio. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Hope.
I'm excited to talk to you. It was an excellent book, and it's a figure that many of us have heard about and read about, but don't know as much about as you do. So I'm glad to talk to you. I'd like to start out with the title of your book. First of all, let's start with the words completely free. Is that a phrase of yours or Mill's or what?
So you find that phrase in Mill in at least a couple places. You find it in On Liberty in a couple places where, for example, in the first chapter of On Liberty, when Mill was talking about the various basic liberties that individuals must be secured or guaranteed. He says that a society in which these liberties are not protected, are not completely protected, cannot be completely free. So that is Mill's phrase, yeah.
Very good. Now we'll get to another word in the title. I'd like to discuss the word moral. And that seems like a word that has fallen out of favor in the last several decades. I know that a hugely influential book in philosophy was the 1993 book, Making Men Moral by the noted conservative legal and political philosopher Robert P. George. But I don't seem to see the word moral in book titles these days. Did you have to think about using the word moral, or does it come naturally to you?
Well, it certainly came naturally to me in writing this book and thinking about Mill, in the sense that Mill is a moral theorist par excellence. I mean, he's thinks very carefully and concretely about the duties and obligations that we have, and has no trouble calling these moral obligations. But I think that Mill, and maybe we'll get into this as well, draws something of a distinction between morality on the one hand and what we might call virtue or ethics on the other. That morality is about the things we must do, that we're compelled to do by our duties or obligations, whereas issues of personal virtue, personal excellence, individual flourishing involve ethics and considerations of value, but might not be obligatory in the same sense. So I think that what has fallen out of favor certainly is that that sense of morality in terms of value and virtue and thinking about what is necessary for individual flourishing, whereas maybe the duties and rights that we have are still referenced with some more frequency.
Thank you. In your introduction to the book, you refer to Mill's work as musical and vigorous, and that's kind of, I wouldn't think that something that's about ethics and moral would be musical. Could you explain what you mean by that? And I find it interesting that you say that that you say musical and vigorous, because as you so clearly say in the book, many of his readers find him very difficult and eteliolated or dry, I guess.
Yeah, I guess, well, that was, I put the word musical in there. I didn't mean it as a provocation, but I definitely might have had a slight, one side of my mouth might have been twitched up in a grin when I put that word in there, because Mill is often taken to be a kind of a dry writer. And certainly in his own time and thereafter, he was considered by many to kind of be a stuffy Victorian intellectual. He was called the saint of rationalism. Many of his early contemporaries called him kind of a made man, that he was kind of like a construction or product of his upbringing and didn't really have any sort of individual animating vigor or energy to himself. But on the contrary, I find Mill's writing to be beautiful, to be, I think he has a felicitous pen. I mean, I think that his turns of phrase are extraordinarily memorable and musical in the sense that his words and phrases and the way he constructs his ideas and presents them, there's a flow and flux to it that I find that's almost like listening to a great symphony, that you really feel. And this, I think, is indicative of, this is maybe suggestive of his early course in being part of a debating society where he had to learn to sort of work a room. And I think his writing certainly illustrates that.
I think it was Gladstone who called him the saint of rationalism. Yes. Is that right? That's really interesting, because he's not exactly known for being reader friendly and easy to digest himself. Right. So, but and then speaking of Gladstone, let's situate Mill in time in terms of his contemporaries. I was curious. I looked up the year. I Googled the phrase "famous people born in 1806," and interestingly, Mill was the top of what came up, which surprised me. He outranked Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which I thought was a little unfair to Browning. But and another one in 1806 was Isabel Kingdom Brunel, the famous engineer. And I just know, and I'll go on with this, I just think it's kind of fun to see who he was surrounded by. He was 6 years older than Dickens and 2 years younger than Disraeli. Could you give us a background on what was happening in British society that Mill was reacting to in his writings?
Yeah, so I mean, Mill lived through the mid-19th century, which was a period of rapid, unprecedented transition. I mean, it was an era of democratization. It was an era of industrialization, and it was an era, of a lot of popular agitation for the suffrage, for various rights, for the limitations on government, and Mill really sits at the forefront of that. I mean, his work on liberty, 1859, is kind of a seminal, timeless text, I would certainly argue, and I hope I make that case well in the book. But it's also a very kind of timely essay that he wrote. It very much is of its time, in the sense that Mill takes up the question of the relationship between the individual and government, and the extent to which the individual should be preserved from societal and governmental interference. And that becomes a more pressing issue in Mill's time, because he also this is the influence of Tocqueville upon him, certainly, and Mill came to a lot of these ideas himself as well. He was concerned that he was concerned that we were moving toward a kind of flattening mass society, and that democratization, while a good, I mean, Mill, I think, certainly saw democratization as something positive and to be valued, that it had certain unique dangers, that posed certain dangers and risks that had to be accounted for philosophically, and that obviously, and on liberty, that's the concern of, not, governmental interference, certainly, but also social interference, the censoring eye of the demos being, I think I phrased it in the book as Mill was concerned about the individual existing in a kind of reverse panopticon, where the individual sits at the center of the social prison, encircled by the monitoring masses. And so that concern, is very much at the heart of On Liberty, and I think of a lot of Mill's work.
Yeah, how would you connect him to cancel culture in that respect? Because I thought of when you wrote in the book about the idea that he was very concerned about public pressure on the individual, and there's certainly a lot of that with the mob mentality and all of that. But at the same time, there's a reverse phenomenon in American society that, in a way, and you also say in the book, fascinatingly too, that he made the point that if you could be, people could, if you were judged, just calling out someone for immoral, what you consider immoral behavior, you're considered a blue nose and a prude and a oppressor. How would Mill regard our own time in that respect?
I think I say in the book that, that Mill, I think I phrased it as our illiberal tribalism that we see coming from a lot of different directions, that he would regard it with a mixture of horror and resolve. Mill,
interesting.
Mill was certainly not a defeatist. This is interesting too, because Mill is often caricatured by certain critics as being kind of a, rationalistic, kind of progressive thinker. And while he certainly had certain kind of hopes and ideals and a vision of a future society and future ways of organizing society that he wanted to move toward, he was very much a rooted, grounded realist. It was for him, his moral and political vision, as I say in the subtitle, was just that. He was gazing toward a horizon that we have to walk toward, oftentimes iteratively, taking 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, 5 steps forward. So he was very much, he had a kind of realistic view. But I think he would definitely regard the tendency of, he would see in cancel culture a kind of domination of the individual by society, that the fear of speaking one's mind and thus being in some way punished by society, such that one becomes something of a social pariah. That really yokes the mind for Mill, and that fear that is exercised over the mind, Mill would readily discern and predict, as seems to be the case, that individuals will self-censor and not speak out, and have a fear of speaking against any particular reigning orthodoxy, whether left or right. So Mill would be horrified, I think, by what is called cancel culture, but it would not be surprising to him. And it would not be, he would see it as something that is, utterly predictable when a society is if a society does not have a strong moral liberal ethos, that's and if a democratic society lacks a strong moral liberal ethos, that's kind of what predictably results from Mill.
It's interesting. I don't want to bring in his personal life too often, because I can do that to the detriment of his ideas. But to me, it seemed, as I was reading and as you were speaking just now about his own resolve, that in his own relations with his future wife, Harriet Taylor, that he was seeing a woman on the side, and people would say to him, this is really going to damage your reputation. You're treading on thin ice here. And he was just adamant. He would just reject that. And as it turned out, it didn't seem to harm him at all. But it was interesting that he just utterly rejected any concern about that. Although it's not like he trumpeted it either to the world too. So he kind of lucked out in that respect. And
certainly, it cost him in the sense of his personal relationships. And part of this, I'm not going to, psychoanalyze Mill necessarily. I'm not, perhaps not qualified, but, he was very, as you're right, he was very adamant about the relationship. Certainly after Harriet's husband passed, and their relation, and they were seeing each other before that, having meeting and talking and having what we would refer to as dates, before before her husband died, but after he died, it became a public fact that they were what we would call an item. And his family, before her husband died and afterwards, his siblings, questioned him, chided him in certain ways. And I mean, he responded, quite angrily. I mean, he basically, by the end of his life, he had basically cut himself off from his immediate family. He had lost a lot of his early utilitarian philosophical radical friends like John Roebuck. I mean, he had lost some certain friends, and he knew that he was an object of kind of gossip and that people were kind of speaking about him behind his back. And I think while he certainly bore up under it and didn't allow it to affect the way he was going to live his life, it definitely, to a certain extent, isolated him from others. By the end of his life, his intellectual and social correspondence and interactions, I think, had diminished to a large degree.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he spent really the last years of his life just kind of living out his life writing. He spent some time in Parliament, but his only sort of his contact was with his stepdaughter Helen, and that was basically kind of the main relationship and consolation of his later life.
Well, I should make clear that he said there was nothing improper about his seeing her. In terms of intimacy,
yeah.
I shouldn't accuse him of being an adulterer because he doesn't seem
right. He makes very clear in the autobiography that the relationship was platonic.
But speaking of him bridling against societal pressures, another fascinating thing in your book was that he did not go to like so many of his contemporaries. Most of his not most of them, but many of his intellectual interlocutors were Oxford and Cambridge men, whereas because of the fact that he was not a member of the Church of England, and for religious tests, he was not allowed to go to Oxford or Cambridge or any university except attending lectures at the University of London, I believe. And that, could you talk about the fact that, do you think that benefited him or did it isolate him further socially? Because he didn't have a cohort of young male friends that he might have had at college. And
yeah, I mean, he goes into this, in his autobiography, and in there are great biographies of Mill as well. Richard Reeves' biography, Victorian Firebrand, is just fantastic, and talking about Mill's early life on this front. I mean, Mill, it was interesting. Mill, started out very much isolated by his father from society. His as is well known, and kind of among people who read and study about Mill in the 19th century, his education was an experiment, basically, kind of a rigorous experiment, which the 20th century philosopher Isaiah Berlin called an appalling success. That's
he's kind of poster boy for homeschooling, I would say, at this point.
I mean, so when John Stuart Mill was born, his father James Mill, who of course was very close to Jeremy Bentham, one of the leading philosophical radicals of the time, wrote to his friend who had just had a son as well, and he said to his friend, let's have a well disputed contest to see who can educate their son and more effectively, and then in 20 years time we'll compare our we'll compare our charges and see who did the better job. And of course, this is unfair if you imagine that John Stuart Mill may have had a natural reservoir of ability and intelligence that is
that's right.
that far outstrips the regular person.
Even his photographs look like this walking brain.
Well, that's what he was, he even says, though, and this is kind of interesting, he says in his autobiography that he went through this rigorous education under the homeschooling of his father, James Mill. He was, reading Greek and Latin by the time he was, 6 or 7. He was, he was more well-read at the age of 10 than most of us, any three of us are in our entire life. And when he first started entering society and kind of, taking trips, and he visited he attended certain lectures and visited Bentham in France and did other things. And his father, walking through Hyde Park, kind of told him, and Mill claims not to have even known this, that his father explained that because you have a father that took the time and trouble to educate you properly, you're going to find you have abilities, and you know things that most people, even your seniors and elders, cannot do and do not know. And Mill was, ostensibly surprised by this. And, but he says in his autobiography, he says, and this, I do not believe this, redounded to this was not a credit to me, because, first of all, it was only because my father took the time and trouble, but also that this would be possible for anyone, because if I had been, very gifted with, natural abilities or intelligence, then that might explain why I was able to go through this and come out the other side. But indeed, I am lower. I am lower than the average in these regards, which seems to be something of a false modesty, because actually there's a letter that Bentham, I believe, wrote to his brother, I believe, where he said, when Mill was visiting him during a summer, I believe, Jeremy Bentham wrote to his brother, the young Mill
to Bentham's brother or to Mill's brother?
To Bentham's brother.
Oh,
so I think Samuel Bentham, I believe, was his name, and Jeremy was writing to his brother about, the young John Mill who was staying with him, and he said that the young Mill has the pride of Lucifer.
Oh,
so,
interesting.
And that was Mill as a young man. But as Mill grew up, I mean, this was really kind of one of the aspects of Mill's life that comes across very clearly in his biographies of him and in his own autobiographical writings, that a great part of his development into his early adulthood was finally meeting people and making social connections, and finally and developing along those lines. And the people he met and the friends he made, had tremendous influence and impact upon his own thinking. And so it was, he was isolated very early on, but throughout the rest of his life, for the most part, kept up a very rich social and intellectual life and correspondence. I mean, I think he describes at one point, he'd be walking to Parliament down the street, and he'd run into 3 or 4 friends along the way, and they'd fall into conversation, and then they'd depart down a side street as he kept making his way to Big Ben. So yeah, I mean, I think so. Mill certainly was isolated early on. I think he was relatively isolated by the end of his life, but I mean, his life was, full of, it's a who's who of, 19th century intellectuals, and many of those relationships, were extraordinarily impactful upon Mill, and probably, vice versa.
Yeah, you refer in the book to his life as being action-packed, which I thought was kind of interesting, because I always thought of him as secluded at the East India office and in his study. But yeah, if you're a member of Parliament, presumably you are pretty active, involved with other people. Although he did have a rather haughty view of his position in Parliament. For example, he wouldn't let people, he wouldn't contribute to his own campaign. He had to be dragged into standing for Parliament. He wouldn't address public meetings, which is a little bit of a strange, considering his view of sociality and also the democracy. He was a very aloof member of Parliament. He basically I have these ideas and I will be in Parliament if you want me to be, but I'm not going to glad hand. I'm not going to be Johnny, happy Johnny kind of thing. But
he didn't want to be a politician, I think, is the bottom line. He wanted to be a philosopher, and he wanted there to be a true philosopher in Parliament. I think is kind of the bottom. But he was, interestingly, I mean, he was when speaking to the public, I mean, he extraordinarily, I think he had an extraordinary integrity in dealing with and talking to the public. There's a famous story of him he had at some point written earlier in his life that the working class, that they have a tendency toward kind of lying and deceit and laziness. He had he wrote this earlier in his life. Whether that's a view he maintained is another question. But he was speaking to a group of kind of the working class, and they asked him, they held this up and said, "Did you write this?" And he responded very casually, "Yes, I did." And they gave him a standing ovation. Because they were so used to people sort of deceiving them and lying to them and trying to manipulate them. So the fact that he told the truth and was honest was very impressive to them. They knew they could trust him, at least, to have that kind of integrity.
Well, given his you mentioned Jeremy Bentham, and it should be made clear that in your book, in fact, probably the first third of the book, or at least maybe the first quarter of it, I would say, is devoted to thrashing out his utilitarian beliefs, his relationship with Bentham, and the very minute and discerning difference, fascinating study that you make in great detail about where he diverged and where he agreed with Bentham. And one thing that was fascinating too is that you talk about his famous nervous breakdown at the age of 20 in 1826, and you posit, although maybe tentatively, that it was because he realized that he was a greater mind and a greater thinker than Bentham was, and that was kind of a shock because he'd been taught or demanded by his father that you will basically worship this man and you will carry on with the utilitarian project. And could you talk about what was going on there? I don't know, you don't want to do psychodramas, but
right. No, well, I mean, so that explanation about realizing that I think it was who was it? I believe it was Elijah Milligram who wrote about Mill, that part of the explanation, that he speculates that part of the explanation for Mill's breakdown was realizing what Milgram calls the vis-a-vis Mill, what Mill viewed as the low intellectual quality of Bentham's thought and writing. So I throw that in there in the book as kind of when I'm explaining one of the differences between Mill and Bentham on the issue of having where Bentham, I make the point that Bentham's philosophy was to a certain extent kind of cramped by the fact that he didn't take other intellectual influences seriously and didn't take other philosophers seriously and criticize him on that front. And so I make the point that may have even been part of Mill's reaction to Bentham at the age of 20 in 1826. But I think the main reason for Mill's breakdown in 1826 was that he recognized that what he called his internal culture was entirely vacant and lacking, that he realized he had no desire for the ends and goals and ideals that he had been up to that point in his life pursuing quite vigorously. So he was raised to be this shining warrior for the philosophical radicals, the utilitarians, and pursuing legal social reform along those lines, in the interest of pursuing universal happiness for all persons.
The thinking machine.
Yeah, right. And so what he realized at age 20, part of when he posed himself a question, he says at age 20, and this is what he says in his autobiography, that he asked himself, if all the objects and ideals that you've been pursuing throughout your life were suddenly realized, would this be a great happiness to you? And he said this answer just welled up within him, a decided no. And at that moment, he said basically the floor fell out beneath him, and that his entire life no longer made sense to him, and he was kind of submerged into a deep depression that lasted for a good long while. And he insinuates at one point that he was close to self-harm or suicide. And this is often interpreted by Mill scholars to be kind of the origin of Mill's break with Benthamism, where Mill suddenly realized that he did not endorse or agree with Bentham's philosophy. But I don't actually think that's the case. I think indeed what Mill again was realizing here was that he had no desire for these ends, the internal culture that basically allows us to see, to observe and experience the objects, ends, activities, and goods we pursue with a sort of pleasure that propels us toward them. Looking at a potential good, activity, end, object, thinking of it with a certain pleasure, thinking of the idea of it, seeing the idea of it as pleasant, because we have a strong internal life that allows us to do that. That was entirely lacking in Mill, because he believed that he basically had this emotionally barren upbringing, that where he was just kind of this walking brain, as you said, and hadn't developed his emotions, his feelings, his sentiments, all those things that make not only life possible and the development of life possible, but indeed worth living. And
yeah,
so
you make the point in the book too that he, as you say, inner culture, that his salvation was reading poetry and Wordsworth. That
right,
was fascinating.
right. So basically he says that it was through the discovery of romantic poetry, particularly Wordsworth, where he started to basically engage in a kind of self-remedial education that had been lacking in his early life. That he developed feelings, emotions, sentiments, and started building up a much richer, more complex, deeper, more nuanced way of thinking and feeling and seeing that had been absent before. Because his father, the utilitarians in general early on, but certainly his father had a very low view of poetry. He basically considered it to be a waste of time. And Jeremy Bentham said that poetry is prose where the lines fall short of the end of the page. That was basically his view of what poetry offered, and so that was basically absent. That kind of the education in poetry, music, all everything that cultivates the feelings and sentiments was largely absent from Mill's early life.
Yeah, when you talk about when you use that phrase that his writing is musical, when he talks about the cultural inner life, is he definitely was quite moving in making clear that he wanted everyone to have a deep cultural, rich intellectual life. And I was curious. I wanted to know what his pastimes were, so I looked up, and apparently he was a passable pianist and an amateur botanist. So that was kind of interesting. About he was very much self-cultivation, but that was very Victorian. He wasn't necessarily unusual in that, was he? I mean, most Victorians were very well-rounded, at least the wealthy were. But
yeah, no, he is very much, I think a man of his time and station in that way. I think the great love of his life, certainly, botany was one of his pastimes, music, of course, but he just loved nature. He loved natural scenery. He loved going into the country and, he would take, walk for 10-20 miles a day sometimes when he was out in the country, and just loved breathing in that. And he early on, when he was visiting the country early on in his life, when he started to develop start developing that internal life that had been denied to him early on, he regarded the countryside and nature as where the soul can breathe deeply and freely, that the mind expands in those circumstances.
He's channeling Wordsworth again. So
absolutely, and it's actually interesting that his love and passion for words, it was so personal for him that he in his debating society, he debated his friend John Roebuck on the relative merits of Wordsworth and Byron. And basically Roebuck, when he was speaking on behalf of Byron and in opposition to Wordsworth, was reading passages of Wordsworth and dismissing them with a scoff, trivializing it, basically treating it as kind of sentimental drivel. And Mill never, like barely ever, spoke about his personal life in these debates, but he was so kind of hurt and threatened by what his friend Roebuck was saying, and he spoke very delicately about how Wordsworth had helped him through a certain period of his life where every day felt like a kind of drudgery or something of that nature, where Mill felt compelled to speak of Wordsworth's importance to him and because it meant so much to him. And now as Mill continued throughout his life, Wordsworth, while he, I think, always retained a kind of admiration for Wordsworth, he fell relatively in Mill's estimation in relation to other poets. I think by the end of Mill's life, he regarded poets like Shelley and Coleridge and Tennyson as being his preferred poets. But Wordsworth was certainly his first love and a kind of turning point in his life.
I think Wordsworth's reputation did fall in his own lifetime because his poetry, by some standards, was not as passionate. I don't know if it was any less good. That's debatable, but it was certainly, and he became more conservative, and maybe Mill didn't go for that aspect of him.
Well, it was actually interesting because Mill met Wordsworth at a certain point, and he came back to his, I forget which friend he was talking to, but he was like he was delighted and kind of like he was in the state of kind of agitated euphoria having met one of his heroes, and he spoke about how and this is kind of a point in Mill's life where all these other influences were rushing in upon him, which made his early kind of course and utilitarianism seem very kind of dry and negative in comparison. So he talks about how even though Wordsworth is kind of like, this conservative individual, that my differences with him are all ones of kind of, prudence and practice, whereas my differences with the utilitarians are ones of principle. So he actually, interestingly, and this is again early on, so he may not have maintained that view throughout his life, but early on, he not only fell in love with Wordsworth's poetry, but Wordsworth's whole kind of, his vision sort of resonated with Mill to at least a large extent at that point.
That's interesting. I love the fact that the poet's name was Wordsworth. That's almost too perfect a surname for a poet. But you mentioned John Roebuck. You don't mention him so much in the book. Is that because he was? You mentioned a little bit about him, that there was a break, but you didn't go into much detail. Is he a significant influence on Mill, or? And he's kind of a forgotten figure. I don't think most people know about John Roebuck.
Yeah, Roebuck is for those who pay attention, who know a lot, I guess, about the 19th century British life. He would be remembered to a certain extent, but I guess I don't mention him as much in the book, just because I didn't want to bring in Mill's biography more than I had to. I really wanted to focus on the texts, and kind of my mindset was like, if I was like on a deserted island and these books, if I had never heard of Mill and his books washed up on the shore, what would I make of them? And that's kind of the mindset that I went into it with. Of course, I referred to obviously Mill's intellectual background, his differences with Bentham, and referred to his autobiography. It referred to his biography when I thought it could help to further elucidate or illustrate or shed light upon his philosophy. But I guess if it wasn't necessary to refer to his own personal life, I tended not to.
Well, I promise in the rest of the interview, I'm looking at my questions in my hand, and most of them are about his ideas rather than his life. So I will get now into the abstruseness part of his life. On your reading of Mill, and you talk about his own intellectual influence and his greater reading than Bentham, how would you say that Mill is like Aristotle and unlike Bentham? And how is Mill like Bentham and unlike Aristotle?
Yeah, excellent. So I guess throughout the book, what I tend to do, certainly, I think throughout the book, but certainly through the first couple chapters and even into the third chapter, is kind of use Bentham as a foil for Mill, that like where Mill goes can be defined in relation to how he criticized and broke away from Bentham. So for example, in Mill's value theory, so this is kind of the where it all begins for Mill. The first principal question of his practical philosophy is, what is intrinsically valuable? What is the good? What is the summum bonum, the greatest or highest good? So for Bentham, answers that question as pleasure, right? So that's agreeable feelings or sensations, agreeable mental states, one might say, is kind of the alpha and the omega of life. It's the raison d'être of life. It's the only thing of intrinsic value. All other things are means to pleasure, and that pleasure is to be evaluated or measured purely quantitatively. So things like the intensity of the pleasure, the duration of the pleasure, that having more pleasure rather than less in a quantitative sense is what happiness is all about. So if the ultimate good of what we're all seeking is happiness, happiness is pleasure, and pleasure is to be measured quantitatively. So as many people might know, Mill first, disagrees with this in the sense that he introduces a qualitative dimension to pleasure. So he says that pleasure is not merely to be measured quantitatively, it's also to be measured qualitatively in terms of the kind of pleasure it is, that there are higher pleasures and lower pleasures, and that higher pleasures, are of the mental variety or of the human variety or appeal to our higher faculties, whereas the lower pleasures can be relegated to being about mere sensation, kind of a mere sensuality. Now, the trouble this causes for Mill, of course, philosophically, and that you can't pick up a book on Mill's utilitarianism without running into some version of this issue or question. How can Mill introduce a qualitative dimension to pleasure without giving up pleasure as the end of life, or what is called hedonism, altogether? Isn't it, what makes one pleasure higher than another if it's not either it being more pleasurable in a quantitative sense or it having some kind of quality, feature, attribute, nature to it that makes it, higher or better than pleasure, that he's appealing to some standard that cannot be reduced to a sort of hedonism. Now, I argue in the book that, qualitative hedonism, I don't think is conceptually incoherent in the way a lot of Mill's critics want it to be, but that nonetheless, Mill does indeed break away from hedonism, and that Mill's introduction of quality cannot be reconciled with a hedonistic view, that he does indeed move away from Bentham's hedonism. But then the question, of course, then becomes, so what sense are we to make of Mill referring? So he does refer in chapter 2 of Utilitarianism to pleasure as the end of life. Right. So if he accepts pleasure as the end of life as the kind of the standard of happiness, and if he introduces this qualitative dimension that can't be reconciled with hedonism, what are we to make of this? Is his declaring pleasure to be the end of life incompatible with what he argues, or is there some kind of deeper reconciliation we can come to? And I think what he's doing, and this is kind of the argument I make in the latter part of chapter 1 of the book, I think what he's drawing upon is the notion that pleasure is not extrinsic to the good life. It's essential to the good life, but it's kind of a byproduct of pursuing or realizing the good. And pleasure, in order for something to contribute to one's happiness, pleasure has to supervene upon the good or activity that one is pursuing or engaged in, such that, I do something for its own sake, taking a walk, going to the opera, playing chess, and these goods and activities can be intrinsically valuable and intrinsically worthy in the sense that they appeal to and engage our higher faculties in activities that kind of have a certain, quality or feature or attribute that make them desirable. But that doesn't contribute to the good life for Mill. And it's not just engaging in those activities themselves. We have to, derive pleasure from that pursuit, from those goods and activities, that they have to be pleasing to us. So the reason that Mill, I think, can indeed coherently claim pleasure to be the end of life is that the goods and activities that are going to appeal to different individuals are going to be different. And of course, this is getting into, on liberty and his theory of individuality, that if pleasure needs to supervene upon the good, but if the goods that appeal to different individuals are going to be different, then indeed we can talk about, pleasure as being sort of the, that's the sign or signal, right, that for a particular individual that they're realizing their particular happiness, because they're not engaging a good or activity that appeals to this or that, some other individual. They're engaging in a good or activity that appeals to them, and thus they derive pleasure from it, and thus they can live happily. And Mill takes that notion of pleasure being intrinsic to the good life, but being what supervenes upon the good. So pleasure is ultimate, it's essential, but it is not itself what the good is. The good is the activity of the higher faculties in accordance with the higher pleasures, and pleasure has to supervene upon that activity for happiness to be realized.
Well, speaking of the ultimate good and virtue, and we discussed Aristotle. Can we now discuss the other big A, which is Aquinas? Is there any evidence that Mill read Aquinas at all, or and was he influenced? I think there's a slight reference in your book to natural law. How did Mill have any relation to natural law thinking? He's cited by Robert P. George occasionally in his public speaking, but mostly about Mill's ideas on liberty and free speech rather than philosophy. Is there a connection at all between Mill, and how was he regarded by conservatives, other natural law thinkers, and other conservatives?
Right. Well, so to get to your first question, I don't recall there being any place. I don't recall Mill referring to Aquinas in any kind of constructive way where, I'm not sure there's any evidence that Aquinas was an influence upon Mill, or that Mill read Aquinas very closely. I could be wrong about that. I don't recall that. But I think they're but in that Aristotelian kind of Thomistic tradition of kind of the good life, being that that in both of those cases, right, that pleasure supervenes upon the good for both Aristotle and Aquinas, there is a kind of resonance there. The other question about how conservatives, relate to Mill or regard Mill, I think the key distinction to make is that there are the reasons that conservatives typically think or imagine they have for taking issue with Mill, and the reasons that they actually have or ought to have for taking issue with Mill. So typically, right, if you look at kind of conservative critiques of Mill, we can go down the line that his value theory begins with hedonism, but and ends up with a kind of that's the start of his value theory, and it kind of the summit of it is a kind of self-aggrandizing, antisocial kind of atomistic individualism. So in his moral theory, that he was while again modified and different from Bentham in various ways, he was a consequentialist. He was a Benthamite consequentialist. In his liberal theory with the harm principle, that he's drawing the strict dichotomy between the individual and society. He's offering us a libertarian radical principle of non-interference. So I
was just going to say that I did find it confusing as a reader to not of your book, but of Mill's thinking, that he would talk about the individual being paramount, individual liberty, but also he said, and if you're free, you will have more time to make society better, and that could you explain to listeners the seeming I interrupted you were doing it actually, but the contradiction between sociality and the individual as the center.
Right. So what I was saying there, so what I was leading up to was that that's fine. All those reasons I just listed for conservatives taking issue with Mill are reasons they might think or imagine they have, but I don't think that those criticisms are true to Mill, even remotely. I don't think he was a hedonist. I don't think he gives us a kind of self-aggrandizing, atomistic, antisocial individualism. I don't think he was a Benthamite or even really a consequentialist. I don't think the harm principle is kind of a principle of radical non-interference. So those are all, I think Mill can be kind of, can be acquitted on all of those charges. But there are other reasons we might get into that conservatives might take issue with Mill. But to get to the question you just asked about individuality and sociality. So I think for Mill, right, I think this is his rejection of psychological egoism, which he's often been accused of being a psychological egoist or a psychological hedonist. In fact, I think Mill places strong kind of, co-equal emphasis upon individuality and sociality as being part and parcel of the good life, and being we have to both develop the individual and social aspects of our nature in order to be a fully developed, well-rounded, happy person. That it's not just about, he defines, one of the, again, the critiques that come of Mill often come because people are, Mill sounds one way in a certain setting or a certain text because he's responding to a particular problem or answering a particular question or speaking to a particular concept like individuality, and leaving the other half out, even though he's not contradicting it or devaluing it. So, for example, in On Liberty, he says, the only freedom that deserves the name is pursuing our own good in our own way. Now, that sounds like a very kind of, self-referential, individualistic statement. But that to Mill there is just defining, the individual side of happiness. But we can't, but part of, but pursuing our own good in our own way does include all of the, social values and social desires we ought to have, and also excludes harm and harming others and harming society, which as I read that in chapter 3 of my book, for Mill is in the most basic sense, harm for Mill is a kind of injustice, that we can't act unjustly toward others. But the reasons I think the reason why I think if a conservative was going to take issue with Mill, I think the place to do it, the place where you're going to have the most traction and where you can really press Mill, is on his refusal to consider, he out of hand rejects, the possibility of, morals legislation, morals laws. So what's interesting about Mill, and what I find so fascinating about him, is that he really is working out of what Isaiah Berlin referred to as, the central tradition of Western thought, that political society exists properly and naturally, not merely for, life, or for guaranteeing rights, or for, preventing people from bumping into one another and violating one another's life, liberty, or property, as Locke would have it, but indeed ultimately, and thus in some sense, some teleological sense, primarily for the sake of the good life. That institutions, laws, society ought to be organized principally for the sake of individual and social flourishing. And that is interesting because what Mill then does, right? So, Mill then tries to build a kind of strident, thoroughgoing, liberal view of society out of that tradition of thinking. That he's a liberal not because of any appeal to abstract right, not because of any appeal to a social contract, not by any appeal to reason or anything like that. It's that his liberalism, he's constructing a liberalism that he believes is vital to the flourishing of the individual and society. And what's interesting there, and where you can press Mill, is when he gets to arguing on liberty that individuals ought not be interfered with for any reason other than harm, that you can't interfere with them paternalistically simply because you believe they're acting in a vicious or low, debased fashion, or they're wasting their lives, or they're dissipating, or they're not they're not pursuing the right goods or the right ends, they're not living well.
Yeah, at this point, I wanted to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you do such a marvelous job in the book of quoting just exactly the right people, or obviously, but in the most amusing or the most telling ways. And you have this wonderful passage about what you were just saying about the individual's right, and we shouldn't interfere. And you quote James Stephen addressing a pimp in Mill's voice, and it's really funny. It's just, I wanted to, if I had time, I would read the whole thing, but yeah. He just says this kind of voice of being Mill talking to the pimp about, I don't really want to interfere with your lifestyle, and it's very admirable in its own way, but maybe you might want to consider some alternative path to your conduct. But I don't want want to push that on you, and it's just very rollicking and funny, and you can see.
Sorry, let's go on.
No, I was just going to say, I would wonder what reaction. And did you laugh as you were writing that?
Oh yeah, no, I include that whole passage because I just found it so amusing, and I say after quoting that passage, that if Stephen is if Stephen is Aristophanes here, clearly Socrates, from Aristophanes, the clouds, that he's mocking him scathingly and relentlessly, but also very humorously for kind of his impossibly circumspect attitude toward all so-called, experiments in living. And that's, Stephen, kind of, hits a nail on the head there in a sense where, there's, that is whether or not Mill there is making some kind of category error between intellectual virtue on the one hand and moral virtue on the other. I mean, Mill clearly believes, as any Aristotelian would, that the development of virtue is all about, you have to be habituated and educated and cultivated properly in order to lead a good life. And that knowing what the good is, he's knowing what the good is not sufficient if you don't have the kind of proper moral makeup in order to exercise your faculties properly in accordance with the good. And so it's kind of like, in what sense will persuasion or exhortation be at all efficacious with people who don't have the kind of virtues and excellencies that a person needs to have in order to act well and to act well with pleasure. And I think, Mill, of course, there's that point, on liberty, maybe the most controversial passage in his essay and perhaps in his entire corpus, where he says that, of course, he says, oh, of course, my doctrine of liberty, this harm principle, that the individual should only be interfered with when they're acting harmfully, or as I would interpret that, unjustly. This does not apply to people in the immaturity of their faculties, he says. It does not apply to what he calls, children or barbarians. Now, and that kind of gets to the fact that, of course, children, they need to be cultivated, they need to be educated, they need to be brought up in a certain way in order to exercise their higher faculties in accordance with the higher pleasures. But the question then arises, and it's an interesting, and this is where I was kind of getting to this, where a conservative could really, I think, press Mill on this point and have some traction. That what about if we're just positing that theoretically, that's true, that let's just follow Mill for the sake of argument, that his doctrine of liberty does not apply to individuals in the immaturity of their faculties. Okay, well, that then applies, as he says, to, barbarians, which, ostensibly Mill would say, exist in, lower states of society, certainly not Britain, but but other places out there, and this of course applies to children who exist in lower and higher states of society, right? So children if you have a society, you're going to have children, but he doesn't really. But what about those, barbaric or childlike adults that exist in a higher state of society? What about those individuals, those individuals who have obtained, the age of reason, but who are still in the immaturity of their faculties? This is, whatever we want to say about that, whatever arguments, outside of Mill we want to make about that, for Mill, theoretically, this is a really interesting issue, because his basic response to this, right, is like, well, he says in On Liberty, if society allows, individuals to grow up mere children, society only has itself to blame. Well, okay, we might concede that society only has itself to blame, but does that bar society from remedying its errors? Does it bar an entirely new generation from rectifying past injuries, wrongs, or neglect? And is it society as a whole, or what if someone just had a bad early life, has had bad influences? It's not society as a whole that is to blame necessarily, but only particular parts or aspects of society. So why can't other parts of society, step in when the individual is clearly, dissipating or clearly acting in a acting in a vicious or low debased manner, and that's theoretically for Mill is a real question. And he kind of, there's a sense in which Mill just like doesn't want to have it, like he just doesn't. He wants to kind of shove that issue aside and wants to push it into the shadows, and so he kind of has these
that issue being.
The issue being the question of an adult, not a child, in a higher state of society who seems to be in the immaturity of their faculties.
I was going to say on that point, it's kind of funny because you talk about his reaction regarding people as children. There's that famous quote when he was in Parliament and fed up with the conservatives. He wrote, he said, although it's not true that all conservatives are stupid people, it is true that most stupid people are conservatives.
Right.
He had quite a number of people that he regarded as maybe not worthy of public admittance to the public square on his level.
Well, interestingly there, that's I think in Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, he opens the book with that quote, and sort of, so Mill is framed and cast immediately as, the great enemy of conservatism and as being, the overflowing font of the absolute worst of, modern liberalism. But one little thing on that, because Mill, when Mill was saying that, he was referring to the Conservative Party. He wasn't referring to like people who were who had conservative views. He was referring to the members of the other party. So he was speaking in kind of like a provocative partisan fashion. And Mill had, he kept up had a deep and rich appreciation for conservative intellectuals. So while it was perfectly understandable and irresistible for someone like Kirk to begin his book with that, and of course that line is always going to be trotted out when people need to frame Mill in a certain way. The context, I think, forgives him a little bit.
That's true. I should have said it was in the midst of the debate.
Oh no worries, because Mill, Mill the politician, right? Mill was a staunch member of the Liberal Party, and while he, again, his intellectual life and in his own personal philosophical views, I think you can see elements of conservatism in various ways, but he certainly politically was raring for the fight. So.
Well, at this point, I just want to remind listeners that we are talking today with John Peter DiIulio, the author of the book Completely Free: The Moral and Political Vision of John Stuart Mill. And now, John, you've covered Was there anything more on that topic that you wanted to add, or I interrupt you a lot? I know. So.
Oh no, it's fine. No, I just think that I guess my point there is that I don't think conservatives looking at Mill, I think it's high time, let's say, for conservatives to there's nothing wrong philosophically with bringing Mill to the table, because Mill's not a hedonist. He's not an atomistic individualist. He's not, a Benthamite consequentialist. He's not kind of a, radical libertarian. In fact, on all of those scores, I think he has views and has his philosophical output can be, that a conservative can find it not only resonant, but interesting, helpful. And I think the only real point of conflict, if conservative was going to have coffee with Mill, the point that I would urge him to press Mill on is that issue of why, obviously Mill wants to say, right, that of course if people are engaged in certain kinds of voluntary associations, friendships, families, churches, what have you, that in those voluntary circumstances, those parties can, if it's part of the relationship, right, those parties can more or less kind of, interfere in various ways with the individual's activity to kind of, spur them toward better conduct. But why can't society, why can't the law play a subsidiary role? And I think that Mill, while Mill, I'm sure, could, has answers and wants to argue the point, that's where I think that's kind of the, it's not the Achilles heel, because I think Mill has strong prudential reasons for resisting morals legislation. But of course, you mentioned one of my old teachers, Professor George, who in his book Making Men Moral, he as well has very strong, he happily and eagerly concedes that there may be strong prudential reasons not to engage in morals legislation. The question is why, in terms of principle, why is it wrong in principle to consider the law or social pressure as being out of bounds to play a subsidiary role in preventing individuals from, falling victim to, various vices and various kinds of activity that are contrary to individual and social flourishing. And I just think Mill there, it's kind of the, it's the weak hinge. It's the place where the welding is not quite what it ought to be in his philosophy. And that's really where I would press Mill. But once we get there, once that becomes kind of the locus of concern, I mean, we've already gone a very long way toward, I won't say rehabilitating, but seeing Mill in a light that doesn't put him into any necessary antagonistic relationship with conservatism writ large.
Well, I think your book is very valuable, and that's really one of the reasons you wrote it, was to have all of these different camps and factions and schools of thought discover him anew. And you say very, very helpfully to the reader that I just wasn't satisfied with any of these critiques, and that I wanted to summarize, encapsulate, and bring in a new view. And I'd like to ask, now that we've dealt with the conservatives, I don't know if you saw it, but there was an interesting news story about Nadine Strawson, the former head of the ACLU. She had a piece in the New York Times in the summer, I believe, and she said she's shown in the picture wearing with a red MAGA style hat that says "Make J.S. Mill Great Again." Would you buy one?
Oh, certainly. No, I think Mill. Here's what I'd say. Like, I've been asked. I won't ask you to ask me, but I've been asked. Many times. I think about this often too, like, what am I? Liberal, conservative, what have you. And I often have, I feel like I'm liberal one day, conservative the next, and maybe that means I'm something of a moderate. But I oftentimes think about that question in terms of, like, if I wanted to, who would I want if I wanted to talk about the issues and problems and questions we're facing as a society, and I wanted to get the take of, the great philosophers of the past, who would I desperately want at the table? And I mean, like, Mill is one of the first people that comes to mind, because I think he, in a very interesting, I mean, not only was he just such a brilliant, capacious, nuanced person and thinker, but he also, as I was alluding to before, really, in a very fascinating way to me, bridges the gap between what, again, Isaiah Berlin referred to as the central tradition of Western thought about your political society existing for the sake of individual and social flourishing, ultimately, and thus primarily, and a kind of, the modern and contemporary liberalism that we're familiar with which is supposed to be neutral with respect to the good, and Mill wants to argue that, that you can have a very rich, thick, strong liberalism, and that is built entirely out of that central tradition and from that point of view. And so there's an interesting kind of, one foot being on either side of this kind of thick line in the ground that makes Mill such a compelling figure for me.
Well, at the end of the book, you argue that he's a humane moderate. And I just wonder, in terms of the kind of aggressive progressivism these days, where Mill's terminology is liberty and freedom, whereas the progressives tend to say equity and justice. Well, although Mill discusses justice too, but do progressives even address him, or do they know of him? I mean, they don't really engage with him, and in fact, they might just regard him. Oh, he's just another dead white male, and also one more question in terms of he's a classical liberal in a way that maybe Salman Rushdie would be his modern analog, or who do you think of now as being Millite on the public stage?
Yeah, well, I think the first question about Mill vis-a-vis kind of the capital L left. I mean, I think that the left and progressives in general, you know, I don't necessarily see them engaging seriously with Mill, but
Mm.
in a sense, like there's just a different story there. There's a different narrative. They have different intellectual influences. They're rooted in a different tradition, right? So the story I tell in this book is like, you have to follow along, not follow me, not understand what I'm saying, but like you have to be willing to see this story unfold and follow Mill's train of thought and logic and find it, at least find it plausible, if not compelling, from looking at what do individuals as individuals desire in order to make them happy. Mill plants that seed and it grows into this classical liberal Republican vision of individual and social flourishing. And so that's a whole story. That's a whole narrative that is if you start from different premises, if you have a different kind of once upon a time, then the story unfolds very differently. I mean, for Mill, right? It's everything begins. I think Richard Reeves, in his book, his biography of Mill, helpfully says that, I believe it was Reeves who said that Mill is a liberal, a Democrat, and a socialist in that order. Now, socialist does not mean for Mill, state, kind of the state socialism that we typically think of today. He was more talking about limitations or ways of curbing the sort of laissez-faire capitalism that was prevalent in the 19th century, which inspired obviously a lot of the more radical socialist writings. But for Mill, everything begins, it has to come from liberty, affirm liberty. Nothing that violates individual freedom is acceptable. Freedom in the sense of non-domination, that kind of a zero tolerance policy for arbitrary power. That Mill would rather see the world burn than give that up. And nothing ultimately good, nothing ultimately and truly and sustainably and enduringly good can come from any other without respecting liberal justice and individual freedom. That those two values sit at the core, and even if they seem to pose roadblocks or inconveniences to making social political progress across certain dimensions, the inconvenience or roadblock they pose is only apparent. That nothing good truly can come with nothing good can truly or enduringly result that does not respect or originate in individual liberty and personal freedom. Those things have to be respected and sacrosanct if we're going to make any kind of true progress.
Well, you make the point in the book that one of the most fascinating, and I wish I did left more time to go through all of them, but you talk in the book about his concept of domination, and just read some of what you had as demoralization, domination as demoralization, as diminution, as enervation, as infantilization, as trivialization, as uncertainty. And I wonder if you could pick out whichever one of those you think were really key, because it was a fascinating section of your book, and because I hadn't thought about. It's as you say, it's very rich and nuanced. And are those his terms, or again, are those your terms?
I mean, I kind of slapped these labels on. So what I was doing in this section, I think kind of the context here is that, so I come at the end of, in chapter 4, I make an argument that, while Mill obviously, understood individual liberty to be, kind of how what we classically understand it to be, as kind of, the freedom of the individual from interference, and had various reasons for valuing it and even protecting it, that ultimately his richest, deepest concept of freedom was what we might call non-domination, which I take this from another one of my teachers and mentors, Philip Pettit, where liberty is not in those terms understood as mere freedom from interference. It's freedom from arbitrary power.
Mm.
Right? So it's freedom from being in a state or condition where some institution, some society, what have you, can interfere with you at will and with impunity across a certain range of interests. So kind of the model of that would be a master slave relationship, where even if the dominus or the despot, who holds the arbitrary power over you, is not interfering with you, even if they're benevolent, let's even say, they still violate your freedom insofar as they wield arbitrary power over you. And interferences, and on a freedom of non-domination understanding, interferences that properly are controlled by and track the general interests don't violate freedom because they don't instantiate arbitrary power. So what I'm doing in this section is that, the question then becomes, why value non-domination? If you have a benevolent despot who gives you all the free reign you could possibly want to have, why care if they're, a dominus or a despot who holds arbitrary power, who could interfere with you if they so chose, as long as they don't? And of course, the, classic traditional answers to that is, on the one hand, well, if you're dominated, you're not secure. Your liberty is at risk of, arbitrary interference. And on the other hand, we might criticize dominate. We might take issue with domination because it is a kind of status deprivation. That it's just a, it's not to be accepted to be in the condition of a dominated party. It's undignified, what have you. To be in that kind of condition, that is for a non-axial kind of reason to be objected to. What Mill does interestingly, I think, throughout his corpus, and this is kind of the main archaeological aspect of my interpretation, where I kind of went through and had to collect and collate various reasons Mill has for objecting to domination. What he gives are reasons we ought to take, reasons for valuing non-domination and taking issue with domination that are kind of they're ends based, in the sense that where Mill explains in various ways why domination is contrary to individual happiness, but they cannot be reduced to interference. There are reasons that domination conflicts with, violates, undermines the happiness of the individual, that doesn't have anything to do with the tendency of the dominus or despot to interfere with the individual. So for example, to get to your question, so for example, something like domination is diminution, where the despot or the dominus, if they have a kind of power over you, a kind of responsibility for conducting or controlling or regulating or governing a certain aspect of your life, that they have a kind of, if all the sovereign power is vested in a monarch or a dictator or what have you, and you don't have any kind of, say, political sway or control, that basically takes an entire arena of human activity where the individual could develop, could cultivate, could exercise their higher faculties in accordance with the higher pleasures of that particular arena, and thus achieve, and thus cultivate and develop their nature in a new and different direction, and thus kind of augment their happiness, their flourishing, kind of those branches on the tree of happiness can thus kind of grow out and grow leaves and flourish. Well, if a despot say holds all political control and authority, well, those branches off the tree of happiness are snapped off. If it diminishes the extent to which one can develop one's nature, it diminishes the extent to which one can exercise their higher faculties, and thus diminishes kind of ultimately what they can be as a human being. So that's like one area where it's not that the despot is going to interfere with you in any particularly objectionable way. It's simply the fact that what you could as an individual partake in and have responsibility for and develop yourself in accordance with is taken out of your sphere of influence, and thus you are to that extent diminished in your flourishing.
Well, I just want to say, as I read the book, that when he an extensive discussion of his views on personal autonomy and freedom from arbitrary power, reading it in the middle of a pandemic after we've seen a lot of well-meant but clearly in some cases excessive uses of arbitrary power that didn't even make sense scientifically. I don't want to get too political, but it just seems as though people could read Mill and talk about maybe we need to rethink the use of arbitrary power in emergency situations. And I think that, can you talk about his value in that it makes us, what are we owed as citizens, and what is our, as you say, at one point Mill would say, well, that's your own fault that you're not exercising your autonomy, and yet you have to be a responsible citizen and care for others, as so forth and so on. So he seems like the ideal thinker for so many complex debates about public health and individual sovereignty and free religious liberty, which you quote Robert George as saying he simply wasn't very interested in, even in spite of the fact that he was a victim of a lack of it. But he just wasn't. That was not something that really buzzed him particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I think he does refer to, just to go off on that point for a second. He does refer. I mean, he refers to religious liberty and on liberty. I mean, he talks about how religious liberty is the one area where people have hitherto defended it on grounds of principle. He talks about, later in the book, about the importance of allowing for kind of religious education. So it was there, it was in the background, but he didn't see it as kind of like distinctively important, let's say, from other kinds of liberties. But to get to your point about the pandemic and COVID, I think reading Mill, if someone who takes Mill seriously, who is very invested in Mill's thought and thinks that he presents a persuasive vision of the individual and society, and the two in concert. I think there are a few reasons why such a person could be concerned with or critical of. I mean, again, I'm absolutely I'm a citizen observer of this as anyone else is, so I'm certainly no expert, but just in my own observations, a few reasons why someone could be concerned. I think first of all, in the public discussion about what to do about this as the pandemic was just getting underway, I don't think Mill would be sufficiently satisfied with the extent to which individuals kind of coveted their liberty, their true liberty. I mean, not obviously there's the kind of, I mean, Mill's not a libertarian, I don't think so. There was obviously that aspect of the conversation, but the extent to which there wasn't a sense that liberty is something more than a kind of nice thing to have. It's good while it's good while it lasts. It's good to have it. It's a nice privilege. It can be traded off rather easily against other concerns. Whereas Mill really wants to impress upon us the absolute essential, vital, critical importance of individual liberty and maintaining an atmosphere of freedom, and a strong aversion to and suspicion of kind of sweeping limitations on individual freedom and spontaneity and activity, that there ought to be a real, while certainly Mill is the first to confess and even trumpet that there are things we owe to society. There are plenty of things we owe to society. He's not a libertarian. He believes that society has the authority and to even compel certain things from us.
He even voted in Parliament for capital punishment, which was interesting. Mm-hmm. And he even said this may surprise people, but I'm voting this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and he on liberty itself, he goes through various kind of positive interferences that the government can engage in, where the individual may exercise their liberty in that direction anyway, but the government can compel it for the sake of the social good. At the same time, that's always on the other side of the ledger. What that's being compared to is a real thick, strong sense of just how vital and essential individual liberty is, and that it cannot be traded off against kind of social concerns in an easy fashion. So I think that's the first thing that Mill would say, that just despite even despite the risks and threats posed by a burgeoning pandemic, that our unwillingness and the kind of the we ought to feel much more we ought to feel much more uncomfortable than perhaps we do about sacrificing our individual liberty. I think the second thing on that point is that I think Mill would be concerned, and Mill would emphasize that whenever you're facing a question of individual liberty versus the promotion or achievement of some social good or the avoidance of some social harm, like you're not facing it de novo. Like I think that is important for Mill, that it's not that like every time we are facing a question, okay, should we have individual liberty or certain degrees of interference and social control in this situation, we're not choosing in that particular case for that particular case with no reference to what comes before or after it. Not only is liberty kind of the first principle of justice, and thus we need to have a kind of thick attachment to it. It also is the case that you cannot interfere for Mill without implicitly or even explicitly, legislating, implying a rule of interference, right? Like it's not like, if you're going to interfere with individual liberty, there has to be an explanation as to why you're interfering. And that explanation becomes a rule or principle that has applications to circumstances outside of that particular scenario. And the question Mill would have us ask is, even if in this particular case, we think it's the case that a certain degree of social control or interference could redound to the public good in this particular instance, do we want to set a precedent? What rule are we implying here? And do we want to concede that power to the powers that be, or despite the kind of the risks and dangers we have to face if we don't act in a certain way, is it more dangerous? Taking a larger view of the situation, is it more dangerous to set a kind of rule, to set a precedent whereby a certain rule of interference can be invoked in a vast array of circumstances, perhaps even on an arbitrary basis, and that may not even have limitations, and that is going to be used and conducted by prejudiced, corruptible, fallible, ego-driven individuals who, especially, who not because they're particularly horrible, but because they're human beings, are going to exhibit, are going en masse to exhibit all the worst traits of human beings. And I think the third thing that he'd be concerned with would be, I think the public discourse around the issue for someone who takes Mill seriously was problematic. Obviously, when it comes to issues of math and science, there's kind of that's not as concerning for Mill, because there are kind of definite, agreed upon ways of coming to kind of answers and consensus that are kind of demonstrable, empirically verifiable, falsifiable, what have you. And so in a sense, like, I don't think Mill would take any issue with the fact that the scientific community as a whole, kind of, not coercively, but just kind of pushes to the would naturally kind of ignore and push to the margins anyone who wants to make the argument that smoking is not only not unhealthy, but the best thing you can do. Anyone who says that, like, is going, I think there'd be a natural organic tendency to kind of marginalize that voice, because the scientific consensus around that issue has been going on, has been building and coalescing for a long time. It's mature, it's rich, it's thick, it's deep. Whereas the scientific, the questions and concerns around COVID and around the pandemic, were fresh, were new. There wasn't and it isn't, at least as far as I can tell, any kind of scientific consensus about what we were facing, what the optimal ways were of dealing with it. And there are, I think, a reasonable case can be made and has been made right? Perhaps wrongly, perhaps, for bad reasons, for bad motives, but a reasonable case can be made and has been made that the response to the pandemic was catastrophic and was in many ways a failure, and in many ways made the problem worse, not better, and that it didn't actually, it didn't actually save the people it was intending to save. In fact, it may have, that the effect of, the lockdowns and masking and everything else.
Masking of a 3-year-old in particular
right,
is,
weren't exactly all that effective. And of course, the opposite side wants to say, well, they immediately caricature one side or the other. One side, the people who are criticizing kind of the the orthodoxy are saying, these are, authoritarians, and the other side is saying, well, you're just callous and saying just let it rip, through society. Whereas there's a very a very rich middle ground there where people have tried to plant their feet but have had difficulty doing so because of this tendency to regard, the scientists and experts in charge as treating them as if they are representing a scientific consensus that has been coalescing for decades and is mature, and to that extent, they can properly marginalize dissenting voices. I mean, which is just not the case. Now, if the argument, and it makes no sense to shut down speech in that regard when the issue is so eminently contested and contestable. I think Mill would see the way the public debate surrounding what we were dealing with and how to respond to it, the way that unfolded was deeply problematic, I think, for anyone who takes chapter 2 of On Liberty seriously. And I think if it is the case that the response to the pandemic was in many ways ineffectual, counterproductive, and had a vast array of perverse and unintended consequences, I think Mill would say, yeah, told you so.
Well, John, thank you. I've taken up a lot of your time, and I'd like to ask you now, this is the traditional final question on the New Books Network, and that is, what are you working on now?
Oh, yes. Well, I am currently working on a new project. Hopefully it'll be a book.
I hope so. We like that at the New Books Network.
Yeah. Hopefully, you never want to count chickens or pages before they hatch or are written. But I'm working on a new project on the Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a 20th century analytic philosopher.
Good for you.
A philosopher of action, she is largely credited with kind of rediscovering virtue ethics in moral theory. And it's a project focused on her action theory as largely as it relates to the question of human freedom or free will. So sticking with the topic of freedom, but kicking it up to a more, one might say, metaphysical level.
Well, that's wonderful. I think that American audiences need to know about her because she's well known in Britain, but I think less so here. So that would be wonderful. And with that, I will just thank the scholar we've been talking to today, John Peter DiIulio, author of Completely Free, The Moral and Political Vision of John Stuart Mill. And thank you, listeners. And I recommend this book. I read every word. It's excellent and very timely. He makes John Stuart Mill not only a Victorian, but a man of our time and all time. It was really very, very good reading. So thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.